All right, so for the final part of this lecture, we're going to be looking at the marking guides. So I've decided to go through with you the marking guide for English, and I'll go through with you the marking guides for biology as well, um, just because they are the most easy to go through. Um, if you do have any subject-specific questions about anything from the content so far or about the marking guides in particular, please pop them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer as, well as I can. Um, but yeah, without further ado, let me open up the marking guide for English. Actually, let's do biology first since I already have it up. Um, there's a question from the paper that I'd like to go through with you. All right. This is the multiple choice question book. No. All right. Oh, this is what I was talking about with compare, okay? This question is asking you to compare microevolution and macroevolution. First of all, apologies to anybody who's watching the stream right now who hasn't done biology. In short, microevolution is small differences in genetics in a population. So over time, things like natural selection will cause certain characteristics to be really, really prominent in one area compared to another. So example, skin color distribution across the globe. People who are closer to the equator tend to have darker skin tones because of the increased position of sunlight compared to people who are in high, like away from the equator. That's an example of microevolution. Macroevolution is when those kinds of changes build up so much to the point where two organisms can't be considered a species anymore. So I've got this question asking you to compare micro and macroevolution, and it's a 3-mark question. So if we have a look at the model answer that they've given us, both involve changes in allele frequencies. That's one similarity, and that's 1 mark that they've given to you. But in microevolution, this change occurs blah, 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 blah. The macroevolution, the change is blah, 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 blah. There's your difference. So immediately, if we go back to the definition of compare, which is back here, display recognitions of similarities, differences, and significance. Those are the 3 things that you needed to get the 3 marks that were given in the definition itself. And then that final mark comes from this final sentence. This means that in microevolution, the descendant is blah, 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 blah. Once you've slapped the reason onto the end of the similarity and difference, that grants you full marks to the question. If you had just provided a difference and the significance, you would have lost a mark. If you just provided a similarity and why there was a similarity, you would have lost a mark. And of course, if you didn't provide the reason, you would have lost a mark as well. And only by interacting with the marking guides for these kinds of things can you get a grasp of what to include in each of your answers. Another question that's really good to go through is this one, actually. So, question 24, another 2-mark question, right? Explain 2 ways that classifying ecosystems allows for effective management of old growth forests. Now, a lot of people would have been stumped on this because old growth forests in particular are mentioned in well, I'll show you. If I scroll up to old growth forests. Change in ecosystems. Should be up. there we go. Explain how the process of classifying ecosystems is an important step towards ecosystem management. Consider old growth forests, productive soils, and coral reefs. So they've given you three examples that you're expected to know within the syllabus itself, and one of them, lo and behold, came up as an exam question. What you have to do here is give two reasons for why management helps with old growth forests. But the thing is, the answer that they've given you isn't super, super specific. The first thing that they've said is classification allows us to document, monitor, and communicate information about diversity, which can be used to monitor how old growth forests recover after a disturbance. That's a pretty generic and general statement to make. You could have easily replaced old growth forests with, coral reefs or any of the other ecosystems that the syllabus mentioned and still get the mark for the question. Classification can also be used to identify which parts of an area have similar species and abiotic factors. Again, super, super general. So both of those marks, even though the question was asking specifically for old growth forests, they don't really mention things that are specific to old growth forests. So the marking guide was a little bit lax in comparison to some of the others that we've seen. I think I might pick one more question from 2021. Can't remember. Alrighty. This was a question that I remember reading in 2021. This is my external paper and thinking to myself, what are they even asking in this? And 4-mark question right off the bat, straight after all of the multiple choice, mind you. So you just finished 20 multiple choice questions, and it says in the Linnaean system of classification. So if any of you remember things like domain kingdoms from grade 10, that's what it's referring to there. The features used to classify living things change according to taxonomic levels. Describe, using relevant examples, how these features change. And this is a really, really interesting one because I remember discussing this as soon as the exam was finished. Some people literally talked about evolution, so over time, how these things changed. When we looked at the marking guides for these, it was actually asking you to describe how they change in the system of classification itself. So you got 1 mark for saying that the features used to classify living things change as you go from broader taxonomic levels to more specific taxonomic levels. Again, super, super specific statement. Sorry. Super, super general statement. It's literally just saying that as you go down the levels in the classification system, things get more specific. And then you get 3 marks for talking about the different tiers. So the broad taxa, so the first level or kingdom is the most extensive, and they are distinguished by things like cell type and cell structure. You get 1 mark for saying that. Then the middle taxa, the features become more specific with, differences in fur, body shape, and leaf shape causing those differences. That's the 2nd mark. The 3rd mark comes from an example of broad taxa, so saying domain and kingdom, for example. And then the 4th mark comes with an example of mid or narrow taxa. So if you had said species or genus, you would have gotten it. And this one was such a hard one to think of a response to because you could have easily done a 4-mark question about how, over time features in organisms change because of evolution, and they, start off being these broad from the common ancestor and then increasing in specificity as you get down to the species level. But no, all they were asking you to do is talk about literally the way that the Linnaean system is structured. So unfortunately for those people doing biology, this whole concept of questions being worded in very awkward ways is quite common. Unfortunately, there's one more question that I wanted to go through with you guys from bio. But actually, no, that's okay. What I also want to go through with you are the marking guides to English and to literature as well if we've got time, because that's a subject that I guarantee all of you guys are doing. And it's really important that you write to the marking guides in English. So if I go show all instead, let's go sciences. I want to go senior subjects. Oh yes, if you don't know how to get into these documents that I'm showing you, type up QCEE on the website and then scroll until you've seen your necessary subject. I'm working with English here. Get into the assessment tab, and in that it'll show you all of the resources that I use for sample assessments. If you haven't been using this yet, please do. Let's get up the 2020. Actually, let's do 2021. This is the one that I'm most familiar with, and then marking guide. So in the English syllabus, they give you the marking guide and I'll give you the question booklet with a character-oriented question and usually a theme-oriented question as well. My choice was Macbeth, so I had invited to view the concept of masculinity, so that's the theme-oriented question, or Macduff describes Macbeth as a coward. This is our character-oriented question. Every time we go into the marking guide, actually no, let me get up the marking guide for 2022 because it's more relevant to you guys. I know our English mark was out of 45. This one was also out of 45, so it stayed constant and has broken up into 3 different kinds of criteria. The first kind of criteria that they've given you is your knowledge application. So how well you are able to take the content, take the actual story of the book that you've been studying, and translate it into an analytical essay. So in order to do this like 100% correctly, your analysis of the perspectives and representations of these texts have to be relevant and authoritative. What that basically means, like translated into English, is all of them are accurate to the actual events of the book, but you're not just regurgitating plot events. You're saying this was a plot event that happened. This was the way that a particular theme was represented, or this was the perspective that audience might have held. And then the second thing is you cannot be indecisive with the English external. You have to be very strong with your point and be authoritative in your interpretation. What that basically means is throughout the entire essay, you need to be proving the same thing, or you need to be arguing the same thing. There should be very, very little point where you're like, well, this could also be considered. No, you've got to be very, very direct with your thesis and your arguments. The second thing that you've got to do is analyze your cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And that can go in 2 separate ways. Either you can bring in cultural context references from the actual period that your book was set in. So for Macbeth, for example, if you talk about ancient English, medieval English values, if you talk about social norms back then, that kind of stuff is going to bump up your mark in this criteria. And the second part of that is talking about how audiences in today's day and age are going to view those same events. So you can say, for example, Globe audiences or Jacobean audiences would have interpreted blah, 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 blah. However, contemporary audiences would have interpreted as blah, 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 blah. Offering both of those perspectives is essential in getting the top marks for this first criteria. The second part of that criteria, the second dot point in that criteria, deals with how accurate your interpretation of these assumptions, values, and beliefs are. So, for example, the Macbeth story is set in 11th century Scotland, but it is written in 16th century England. If you got those 2 mixed up, and if you got the social norms from those 2 times mixed up, then you would have dropped marks in the category. The important thing is accuracy and also extent of analysis. The third criteria that comes under knowledge application is your reference to stylistic or aesthetic choices. Now, an important thing to consider here, the difference between stylistic devices and aesthetic choices. Now, this is something that all of you need to know. Stylistic devices are basically all of the things that make up the writer's the style of the writing, or like things that the author has used to literally write the document. So things like characterization, juxtaposition, they're all stylistic devices, whereas aesthetic choices are deliberate, like um uh, things that make the text more colorful. So if you think about imagery, symbolism, metaphors, they're things that put an image of what is happening in the story into your head. That is aesthetic features. Whereas the words and the styling that is used is stylistic devices. So if you ever want to talk about, like in a play, for example, things like soliloquies or rhyme and rhythm, structural things are all stylistic devices. Imagery, metaphors, similes are all aesthetic features. Now, as from 2020, 2021, and 2022, there is an or stuck here, so you can do like one or the other or a mix of both. My recommendation to you is to mention both a stylistic device and an aesthetic feature, at least one of them in your essay, so you've covered all of your bases. Um, that way, in case the marking criteria changes to stylistic and aesthetic choices, you've got yourself covered. So yeah, if you've analyzing those is the third criteria, and then again, authoritative interpretation means that your analysis is correct. So oftentimes play the safe card and analyze things in the same way that other people have analyzed them. You want your thesis to be fresh and your thesis to be unique to you, but if you're going to do an analysis, make sure that it is correct beforehand. Don't just make something up on the day of the external, because a whole chunk of this criteria is about how accurate your analysis is in the first place. So that's our first criteria for English. Second criteria is about your actual structure and the development of your essay. So making sure that your introduction contains, an appropriate thesis. Discriminating thesis basically means that you have you have answered the question in an extremely specific way, and it's a unique take. You're not just regurgitating what, your English teacher might have told you. It's somewhat like the level of analysis that you've done is high. That's what discriminating means. Then you've developed your arguments to strengthen the thesis across the response, and that your arguments have clear conclusions based on the arguments. So that relates back to this first criteria of having an authoritative interpretation. It just means that you are sticking to one thesis and proving it throughout the entire essay. That's incredibly important for you to do. The second thing is selection and synthesis. So making sure that your evidence is relevant to your thesis and your quotes is relevant to your evidence is very good. And then using this explicitly basically means that you've embedded the quotes into your paragraph, or you've referred to plot points by name. So for example, I could say in the soliloquy of the floating dagger in Macbeth, blah 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 blah. That's you name dropping particular things. Logical sequencing of information and ideas in between paragraphs. I remember I did this quite well in my external because ours was on masculinity, and my thesis was basically all about how masculinity is needed in balance to maintain the great chain of being. So in my paragraphs, I had Macbeth as my first dot point, where I basically said his masculinity was blown out of proportion. He ended up killing an entire country. His country bled and wept, I think is the quote. My second paragraph was about Lady Macbeth, where she was trying to repress her femininity and trying to be more masculine, which inevitably, well, number one, she committed very, very sinful acts, and number two, it led to her insanity and committing suicide at the end of the book, which is not good. My third paragraph was about Malcolm. So the prince heir to the throne, if any of you remember, he used a balance of masculinity, or healthy masculinity, to rule the country and then restore it from Macbeth's destruction. So it's logical to go through this. This is an example of too much masculinity. This is an example of too much, like, sorry, this is an example of like giving away your femininity or like overexpressing masculinity that isn't there. And then finally an example of a person who has it in balance. They brought everything back together and resolved the story by its conclusion. So it was logical. Somebody could read along and follow through with it while I was talking about the plot points. If you're doing a more character-oriented question, it's good to start with the events that from the beginning of the book, and then go through each of your paragraphs as if it was going in order of events in the story. It just seems very easy. Like the flow is a lot easier to interpret when you've done it like that. The other thing is use cohesive devices to connect, develop, emphasize, and transition between ideas within paragraphs and across the response. So for this one, what you basically want to be doing is improving the flow of your paragraphs between each other by using linking sentences and like firstly, conclusively, etc., etc. And if you have interacted with this marking guide, you know exactly what they're trying to pinpoint in your essay, so you can include them in and end up with full marks. Well, ideally, we end up with full marks. Criterion number 3 is the textual features. So this is just making sure that your grammar, language choices, sentence structure is all accurate and correct. Notice that the amount of marks allocated towards this section is a lot lower than the other marks for the other sections. So even if you still develop a very well analyzed response that isn't totally grammatically correct, it's better than getting something that is grammatically correct but underdone in terms of analysis. The reason I say this to people are very, very worried about like going under the word count, going over the word count. That is only relevant to one particular it's only relevant to a very small part of the marking guide. So if you are comfortable with all of these criteria and you feel like your essay has met all of the top 2 criteria, chances are you're in good hands when it comes to when it comes to the essay getting marked. But it says use vocabulary with discrimination to develop ideas. My strongest recommendation to you to hit that criteria is to use buzzwords that you would have dealt with in class. Things like, juxtaposition, corroboration, analyze, audience positioning, blah, 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 blah. Privileged idea. Hit those buzzwords and it'll make the job of your external marker much, much easier. And then punctuation, simple and complex words are most spelled correctly. That should all be okay. If you use this, now ideally you want to take this marking guide every single time you do like a practice essay in English during your study, and then go through and check off, have I done aesthetic features? Have I done stylistic devices? Have I done sociocultural assumptions? Have I done them both for the time period being studied and contemporary audiences, etc., etc.? And only then are you going to build up the skill to then have the external marker just check off everything in that highest box. Well, yeah, I'll look at the one for modern history too. Just so I've done a science, I've done a language, maybe, maths is kind of difficult. Maths, you kind of just get the question correct if you can. Let's go with humanities and social sciences, do modern history. Assessment, let's go through the marking guide for this one. 54 marks this time around. Another thing that you can do is compare the marking guides for all 3 years and see if there is a mark difference anywhere. Mark allocation, like so. Alrighty. This time around, it looks like in modern history, you are asked to write a response in terms of parts of the question. Let's just compare them, shall we? Oh, here. Explain one similarity and 2 differences. Analyze evidence from source 1 and 2. you've got two things to do in the question. You get 4 marks for going ahead. That's a 13-mark question in general. 4 marks purely dedicated to the similarity itself. Number one, choosing the similarity and choosing choosing the two correct sources or choosing the two correct pieces of evidence from sources 1 and 2. And the less valid your explanation becomes, the less marks that you get between for that particular criteria. Differences then get 3 marks each, and again, it just explains a valid difference using well-chosen evidence from sources 1 and 2. If you are able to do all 3 of them successfully, that's full 13 marks done. Question 1, comprehending. If you use relevant terms, full marks. If you aren't able to hit the buzzwords, you get less than that. So when you're doing your revision of questions like these, make a note of the buzzwords or the keywords that you need to get full marks, and then incorporate them into your other practice responses going forward as well. In terms of evaluating. Now again, we've got makes a discerning judgment about reliability, well-chosen evidence. Discerning quite literally means you're able to pick out that piece of evidence and give a reason why this evidence would have been good. And that is something that is important across all of your subjects, sciences, engineering, digital technologies, English, and humanities. Here, make a discerning judgment using well-selected evidence. The usefulness statement gets 3 marks. The other source that you are required to analyze also gets another 3 marks. So it seems that as long as you've picked the correct piece of evidence, you should be okay. It's just up to whether or not the piece of evidence that you think is correct is the same level of correctness as the external exam marking person. Alrighty. Going on to ISMG breakdowns. All right, here's some other examples just going through. These are older examples. I wanted to screen share to some of the 2022 examples because they've only been out for a very short time. This was a question that came up in my external. This is 2020. Explain the roles of enzymes helicase and DNA polymerase in the process of DNA replication. 2 of the marks were dedicated to helicase's role, right? So you got 1 mark for saying that it unzipped DNA, 1 mark for saying exposed bases. If you had told any other piece of information about the enzyme helicase, you wouldn't have gotten the 2 marks. They were super specific. But then with DNA polymerase, which is another enzyme, if you had said added complementary nucleotides to the exposed bases, that's 1 mark, right? And that's a pretty easy mark to get. But the entire other mark from the question comes from any random fact about helicase, polymerase, or the process. So sometimes QCEE has these super specific marks where you need very specific words to get them, and others are super general like this. We touched on this briefly before, but the difference between discerning and effective. If you have a look at EAMGs, you'll see these words kind of pop up a lot. Discerning quite literally means the most intellectual take on the topic that you're talking about. So it's discriminating. It shows intellectual perception, good judgment, making thoughtful and astute choices, selected for value or relevance. In plain English, it means that your statements and your arguments that you are making are very accurate and can be backed up with research that is also accurate or evidence that is also accurate. Effective, on the other hand, is usually the drop after that, and that is successful in producing the intended or desired result, meeting the assigned purpose. So you've done it well enough to answer the question, but is it the most perfectly executed thing, or is it the most intellectual perception of it? Probably not. Alrighty. Overall takeaways from today. I hope this lecture was helpful to you all. At the end of the day, any marker that is going to be correcting your external papers is using an exam paper guide to assess your externals across all of your subjects. So every time you complete a practice exam, go through that marking guide for the exam that you're doing, not only for the sake of familiarizing yourself with the right answer, but also sometimes you can learn new information through the correct answers too. The marking guides for humanities subjects are unfortunately subject to change. So for English, it stayed the same from 2020 to 2022 now, but the syllabus is still currently under review. When giving evidence, paraphrase, so only give small bite-sized quotes and choose pieces that can apply to many themes. Um, Sorry, that should say when you're studying evidence, choose pieces that can apply to many themes. But when you're selecting evidence, in your, like, especially humanities and English, make sure that the quotes and like the pieces of evidence that you're mentioning are relevant to the topic. Don't just throw in a quote there because you've memorized it for the sake of memorizing it. So final thing, mark maths and science questions with the guides, as sometimes skipping working can cost you marks, and make sure that you're including everything that you need for that full mark response.